The social reason. Another cause which have been given for the observance of the modest dress is the sense of insecurity. They say that the modest dress appeared because of the lack of security which had developed. There were times in history when those who had power and force held the keys to everything. If people had money, property, and wealth, for instance, if aristocrats had jewels, they had to hide them so that none would know what they had, because whenever it became known what so and so had, powerful persons would forcibly take it away. People who had great wealth would hide it. They would hide it so well, even from their own children, that when they died, no one knew where it was. They were afraid to tell their children for fear they would tell their friends, etc. And then everyone would know what they had. The person would then die, and thus everything that he had remained hidden. Lack of security was very extensive in the past. Just as there was no security in relation to wealth and property, there was no security in relation to women either. Just as men were obliged to hide their money and their wealth, they were obliged to hide their women. History records that in Sasanian Iran, the high priests and princes would seek out and take any beautiful girl that they heard about. The idea of the modest dress then was to hide women so that no other man would come to know about her. Will Durant, in his Story of Civilization, writes about the situation in ancient Iran. Count Gobineau also wrote about the modest dress. The modest dress, which presently exists in Iran, basically relates to pre-Islamic Iran and not Islamic Iran. He believes the difference between the modest dress in Iran and the modest dress in other places is the national characters of Iranians. Thus, in ancient Iran, as history tells us, the men had no assurance with regard to their women. I read a story about the time of Anushiravan, the just who had a major in his army, and even though the major had hidden his wife, word of her beauty had spread. One day, when the major was out of town, Anushiravan went to his wife, and then he returned to his palace. The woman told her husband, the man saw that not only would he now lose his wife, but his own life as well if he tried to keep her. He let her go. Anushiravan was informed that Major so-and-so had divorced his wife. When he saw the major, he said, I understand you had a beautiful garden and that you sold it. Why? The major said, Your Majesty, I saw footprints of a lion in the garden, and I was afraid the lion would eat me. He laughed and said, No, that lion will not be found in that garden again. Thus, there was no security. Everyone lived in fear, and because of this, they say one of the causes for the appearance of the modest dress was insecurity. Then they say that this cause no longer exists. No one takes another's wife through force. Therefore, since insecurity in this sense no longer exists, there is no reason for the modest dress. Just as people can now put their money in the bank where no one will touch it, there is security. Since security exists, there is presently no need for the modest dress. We have to compare this with the philosophy of Islam. Was the reason Islam brought the modest dress because of this question of security? When we look at the issue, we see that neither in Islamic analysis has such an issue appeared, nor does it conform with history. The modest dress did not exist among the Arab Bedouins during the age of ignorance, and at the same time, security existed. That is, at the same time that individual insecurity and aggression against women had attained the greatest extent possible in Iran, and women covered themselves, this type of aggression did not exist among individuals in the tribes in Arabia. The very tribal character protected the women. The security which did not exist among the tribes was social or group security, and covering does not solve this kind of problem. When two tribes fought, they not only took the men, but the women, their children, and everything else as well. Covering would not have protected the women. In spite of the obvious differences which the Arab Bedouins had with our industrialized life, it resembled our life in the sense that adultery, in particular by married women, was rampant. But because of a certain type of democracy and lack of tyranny, no one would forcibly take the wife of another man. Yet, the individual insecurity which a person in the industrialized West sensed was lacking among the Bedouins. The covering prevents the aggression of a person who lives in one place. This kind of aggression does not exist among tribes. Therefore, we cannot say that Islamic precepts established the modest dress simply to provide security. The Islamic philosophy for covering is other than this and will be explained later. At the same time, we do not want to say that the security of a woman against the aggression of a man is not at all to be considered. We will discuss this when we refer to the verse on garments. We also do not feel that this issue is irrelevant today and that women have total security against the aggression of men. All one has to do is to read the newspapers about the crimes committed against women in the Western world. Second lesson. Our discussion will center on the issue of the modest dress, hijab, in Islam. But as we had mentioned, we must first hold a more general discussion because the modest dress is not exclusive to Islam. That is, it is not the idea that the modest dress appeared for the first time in the world with Islam. It existed before Islam among ancient people other than the Arab nations. It existed in ancient India and in ancient Iran as well. The modest dress which ancient India and Iran had was much stricter than that which Islam brought. Of course, if we take the Arabian Peninsula into consideration, the Islamic modest dress was established, not imitated. That is, Islam imported the modest dress into the Arabian Peninsula, but it existed in non-Arab lands throughout the world. It is a phenomenon which existed during non-Islamic times. Philosophical, social, economic, ethical, and psychological reasons have been given as the cause for the development of this phenomenon, and as to how it happened that the modest dress came to appear in history among people. It is necessary to mention these reasons because they have said that these are the causes for the appearance of the modest dress, and that it first appeared because of certain very particular conditions which existed in those times. Conditions whereby it was perhaps necessary for it to be, but now that those conditions no longer exist, there is no reason for the modest dress. Thus, we have to see what the reasons mentioned are, whether or not they are the real causes, or is it, as some people say, that which caused the modest dress to come into being was unjust. Is it that from the very beginning the modest dress itself was imposed upon women? If this is so, they conclude that this is even more reason why it should never have come into being. In the last discussion, we mentioned two reasons, one of which was the sense of insecurity. We said that this has been mentioned as a reason for women wearing the modest dress. The other reason mentioned was the sense of asceticism, the sense of struggling against sexual urges. This is something which existed in the world in both the East and the West. In the East, one of its largest centers was India, and in the West, Greece. The economic reason. Another reason given for the modest dress is that they have said that the modest dress developed because of economics, and of course it was to exploit women. As a result of this, it is unjust. They came and divided things this way. They said history shows that there have been 4 eras in the relations between men and women, including the present age. The first age of humanity, according to this view, was a communal age with reference to sex. That is, essentially, no family life existed. The second era was when men dominated over women, and women were seen as their slaves and a means to serve men. The second era, then, was the era of ownership by man. The third era was the age when women arose in objection to men, and the fourth era is the era of equality of rights between men and women. The first era, the communal age, they say, relates to prehistory. The era of ownership is the longest era that history has recorded where man dominated over women, and they identify Islam as an example of this era. The third era, which is known as the era of rebellion, occurred in the second half of the 19th century. The fourth era is the one which more or less has appeared or is appearing. It is the era of seeking complete equality between men and women's rights. It is clear that these eras were developed from what others said about economics, which refers to the various eras of humanity, with the first era of being communal, then the feudal era, the era of capitalism, and the era of communism. That which they have mentioned as to the economic causes for the appearance of the modest dress does not relate whatsoever to these economic stages mentioned by others. These 4 stages expressed in this manner are all erroneous. There are no facts regarding the first era which they mention as being communal. There is no evidence that family life did not exist from the very beginning. We do not intend to go into detail about these eras, but simply to refer to the fact that they say the modest dress relates to the era when men dominated over women. If we do not accept that era, they say that it resulted from men being the mediator for women. A man hired a woman for his own purpose. He kept her in his home to do his work. He left some of his work for a woman to do for him. This was similar to when they imprisoned slaves and prevented them from leaving to better perform the work of their master. Men saw that it would be to their advantage to put women behind a curtain and prevent their comings and goings so that they would better undertake the work of the house which has been given to them to do. Thus, men did this in order for them to have hired women from the economic point of view and to have turned them into an instrument. Otherwise, there was no reason to do such a thing. Wherever the modest dress has appeared, it was accompanied by such a situation of the employing of women by men to work in the house. Is it true that W's reason existed in those places in the world where the modest dress appeared? We do not deny that perhaps in some corners of the world this situation existed. If men prevented women from leaving their home and prevented others from seeing them in whatever form, if men imprisoned women, the roots of such a cause might have been economic. However, we are discussing Islam. Islam, on the one hand, established and brought the modest dress, and on the other, very directly stated something which is among the very clear aspects of Islam, which is that a man has absolutely no right to gain economically from a woman. That is, a woman has economic independence. Great emphasis has been given to this issue. That is, a man has no right to benefit economically in any way whatsoever from a woman. The jobs of a woman belong to her. If within the home itself, work is given to a woman to do if she so desires. But if a woman were to say, "No, I won't do that," a man has no right to force her to do it. A woman is free in whatever work she does. In the first place, she has a right to refuse. A man has no right to order her to do something. Secondly, if she says, "I will do this for such and such wage," she has a right to receive a wage, in the case of nursing her child, for instance. Even though a mother has priority to nurse her own child, she still has a right to obtain a wage for it. Her priority is in the sense that if another woman wanted to nurse her child and says, "I will take 1,000 riyals a month to nurse the child," the mother herself says, "I will not take more than that." Then the mother has priority to nurse the child, unless the other woman, for some reason, is more suitable. A woman has a right to work outside the home as long as it does not harm the family environment. Whatever she earns belongs to her alone, no matter what legitimate work she performs. It must be clearly recognized, then, that Islamic precepts do not intend for the modest dress to be a means to economically exploit women. If this had been the intention, the rulings would have reflected this. For instance, the precepts would have stated that a man has the right to employ his wife in his home, and the woman must wear the modest dress. Then these two things would have been connected. A system which states that a man has no right to exploit a woman. But, on the other hand, that same system has established the modest dress, clearly then did not establish the modest dress to exploit women. We do not think either that this reason was a very major one, for wherever in the world the modest dress existed. But some Iranians who have written against the laws of Islam have greatly stressed this point. That is, they say in order for men to be able to keep women in their homes, to exploit them, and to turn them into their own tools, they imprisoned them. This is one reason they have given, and as we have stated, this reason in no way conforms with Islam.